We will now hear the exhortation of Brother Steve Dowling to the theme, Letting God Work in Us. Brother Stephen.
Thank you, Uncle Ern, and good morning, everyone. Our daily readings in Judges has started going through some of the instructions and the judgments that fell upon the children of Israel for not heeding the words that they were instructed. For an exhortation today, I'd like to draw from this how important it is for all of us to let God work in our lives and what that looks like in our daily lives. So just for a moment, I want you to imagine that you're an Israelite during the time of Joshua. You live in Beth Shemesh, between Jerusalem and the coast. You're a member of the tribe of Judah, and you've been living in the land for about 10 years, living in the land that God has promised to you. Your house is a very small, very basic house, very much like all that the Israelites have lived in since you moved into the land. Your promised land, it really is nothing more than just basically a pit house dug into the ground or in the side of a hill with a roof. After spending so many years wandering the wilderness, there's no one skilled at building solid houses at all. After all, it wasn't necessary to know how to do that. You basically had to just put up a tent and pack it down again. Most of the work was spent doing that, packing it up, setting it up. There were no solid walls, nicely fashioned gardens at all. So you find yourself in your one-room pit house with all your family sharing the same space. To wash and to drink, you have to gather fresh water from a stream that's about 2 kilometres away that you have to walk to. And this is approximately from here to the beach, if you want to imagine that, for fresh water. You eat off very basic plates using very basic cutlery. In fact, your life in general is described as very basic, very plain, very primitive even, in your new promised land. Now, only 30 kilometres away, which is approximately from here to Mount Barker, live the Philistines in the town of Ashkelon. They have a much more sophisticated lifestyle and environment. Their cities are laid out in sections. There's a residential section, there's a business district, and there's a religious section as well. There are beautiful large brick buildings, several stories, wonderful workings of stone. They even have a waterfront for people to walk along and enjoy themselves. Their houses have several rooms with stone or mud brick walls. Inside their houses they have white walls with nice mosaic floors. They sit down at a table to eat. They eat off beautiful plates and use utensils to eat. They even store their food in multicoloured jugs and pots. And just down the road from their main houses, they have a theatre in Ashkelon with live music and dancing. Life for the Philistines down on the coast was sophisticated. It was cultural. It was exciting. Everything that was good happened there. But meanwhile, you live in the Shephelah, the foothills of the mountains on the west, where life was primitive and it was rough. Over on the coast, the plains, the Philistines lived. It was so much more happening. Culturally, it was exciting. There were events that always happen. Nothing like your little Israelite village. Fine living, exciting events, comfortable places. You live in a primitive condition, uncomfortable, dirty, and life is dull. As a result of this, some of the young people from your village have been going down to Ashkelon and enjoying the social environment that's down there. They've made friends with some of the Philistines as well. Young people that are there, and they go to the dances together. It is much more interesting than anything that happens in Beth Shemesh. The dancing happens to be held in the temple of Dagon. Part of the activities involve bowing down to Dagon. All the Israelites that attend say that they don't actually believe in Dagon, so it's okay. They just enjoy the dancing and they only pretend to bow down because they have it all as part of the dancing and they just pretend that that's part of what they do. They're just there for the dancing. And they take time to assure all the people back in the village that they believe in the living God of Israel. Now, also, the festival of Dagon not only involves good music and dancing, it also involves ritual prostitution. Throughout the festival, priestesses serve drinks to all the people there and make them available to the people that go. But again, this is all just part of the worship of Dagon, and you have no part of that as well. Some of the elders in your village, meanwhile, in Beth Shemesh, have said, let's try and organise our own little musical event that the kids, instead of having to travel down there, can stay here and they can involve themselves and then we can keep them here. But others say they shouldn't have to pander to whatever the young people want to do all the time, and they should just be happy helping out in the farms, living in their pit houses in Beth Shemesh. Now, one of the people of your village wants to marry a girl from Ashkelon. She refuses to come and live in Beth Shemesh, where she'd be in a one-room pit house, and instead she wants to stay in her beautiful four-roomed house where she lives at the moment. And so they plan to live in Ashkelon as well. But they assure everyone that they will continue to worship the God of Israel, even though they'll live in the Philistine city. Now, that picture that I've just painted is very close to what it would have been like for the Israelites in the Promised Land. Based on the archaeological findings in the area, the evidence from that period, it seems that the Israelites lived in a primitive condition, and the Philistines in particular had a highly developed and sophisticated culture where they were. So it's not surprising when we open Joshua and start reading through that we find the children of Israel are having great difficulty in trying to stay separate from the advanced and exciting lives of those who live around them. If you come with me to Joshua chapter 23, we'll see what God said about what their attitude should have been towards these people. Just as they were about to enter into the Promised Land, God had given them instructions as to what they were to do. And now, after they had entered the Promised Land, Joshua was instructing them how they should behave. Joshua 23 and verse 7 to 13. Be therefore very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that ye turn not aside therefrom to the right hand or to the left, that ye come not among these nations, these that remain among you, neither make mention of their name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, neither serve them, nor bow yourselves unto them. But cleave unto the Lord your God, as ye have done unto this day. For the Lord hath driven out from before you great nations and strong. But as for you, no man hath been able to stand before you unto this day. One man shall chase out 1,000, for the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he hath promised you. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, that ye love the Lord your God. Else, if you do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, thorns in your eyes, until ye perish from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. God had told them not to associate with the Canaanites and the Philistines, and yet that's what they'd started to do. They were nice people, their cities were beautiful, they had exciting festivals. Surely it was okay to leave them to live their own lives in their own cities, provided the Israelites did not worship their gods. And yet God had specifically instructed them not to associate with them, or he would stop driving them out before the Israelites. The Israelites disobeyed God through compromise. The Philistines and the Canaanites' culture and their ways were just too attractive to them. The music, the dancing, the immorality, everything about what went on down there was very desirable to the Israelites. The fine living, better housing, good food, it all combined to lure the Israelites away from what they should have been doing into mixing with the people around them. Surely there is a lesson for all of us in this world that we now live in as well. With all the exciting things to do, fine living, fun that's available to us, our world seems to be full of people doing things that are better and more exciting than what we do. Outside of these walls, it looks like they're doing more desirable things and more attractive things than we are. But God has called us to not associate with the ways of this world, just as he told the Israelites here in the book of Joshua not to associate with the Philistines and the Canaanites. Sure, we might not have a temple of Dagon that we get invited to like they did, but we do have certain clubs or movies or social gatherings or events that promote immoral behaviour. When we compare some of the social activities that people get involved in nowadays, is it really much different between them and what it was like all those years ago? The modern shrines to the gods of this world, the consistent advertising to live it up, to enjoy what the world has to offer. And this is exactly what the Israelites experienced when they got into the Promised Land. Their experience wasn't quite the slick advertising that we might see today, but it was definitely the equivalent to 1400 BC. The gods of materialism were strong back then, and they are strong now. Many of us find ourselves falling down in worship to them, sometimes without even knowing it. Compromise with the world leads to backsliding and separation. It destroys the people of God back then, and it still can today. Associating with the world is destructive. It breaks down our spiritual values. It stops you from developing a close relationship with God. The world makes sin look not so bad. That is their job, and they do a very good job of it. But this is not the way God deals with it. The book of Judges is all about associating with the world and what happens when you do so. At first it seems like it's okay, but in the end it kills you. Notice in these verses in Joshua 23 that God never said to them, "You drive out the Canaanites and the Philistines." Have a look at verse 12 and verse 13. It says, "Else if you do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from you." It wasn't the Israelites that had to drive out the Philistines and the Canaanites. God never asked them to do that. God said to them, "You resist the evil, and I will drive the Canaanites and the Philistines out." It was God's responsibility. He would do it for them. The responsibility of the Israelites was to avoid association with the people of the land, to fight when God wanted them to fight. God promised that he would be the one to drive out the nations if they would do their part. But if they didn't do their part and the nation stayed, God wasn't going to help them. And it's the same for us. We can't hope to overcome the influences of this world and the power of sin all by ourselves. And God doesn't ask us to do that. He doesn't ask us to get rid of sin on our own. We don't have the strength to do it. Sin is just too strong. But if we avoid the association with sin, if we keep ourselves free from ungodliness, God has promised to drive out the power of sin from our lives. Come over to Philippians chapter 2. Here are some wonderful verses that give us a lot of hope, a lot of encouragement, because we see that it's not us that's fighting, it's God that is fighting for us. Philippians 2, verse 12 and 13. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do good, and to do of his good pleasure. It's God that works in you. If we work on salvation, concentrating on obedience, avoiding association with sin, then God will work in us. Note the things he says he will do. To will and do. To will, that means what you want to do. He will help us want to do the right thing, and he will help us do the right thing. And also to do or to act. He will help us to make our minds and our actions free from sinfulness and more in line with godliness, and he will help us follow through on that. What an amazing promise from our God, that God will work in us to will and to act according to his good purpose. Just as he promised to drive out the sinful nations from the promised land, he promises here to drive out sinfulness from within our hearts, from in our own lives as well. Our promised land is within each of us. It's our thoughts, our actions, it's our mind and character that we have to cleanse from evil. We have to get ready that we might, through God's amazing grace, live forever. And we can't do that on our own. We have to do it with God's help. Our own efforts are useless unless God assists. And God won't assist us unless we are putting in that effort. Let me tell you a story about a little girl that had a disability. Only partly disabled, but it was still enough to making it even walking very difficult. And this little girl waited at the front door looking out the window for her dad to come home. It was her mum's birthday and she wanted to organise with her dad the present. So this little girl saw Dad pull up in the driveway. And then she, as good as she could, she made her way out to the car and she said, Daddy, let me carry the present in for Mum. And he said, well, no, look, it's a big box. It's too big for you to carry. And she said, no, I'll carry it. He said, look, in the nicest way, you can only just walk. You can't carry this big box. And she said, no, I've got a plan, Dad. And she says, give me the box. So he gives her the box. And she said, now you carry me. And that's the way that God works with us. He requires us to carry the load, but he knows that we can't do it on our own. So he carries us and it becomes possible. He wants us to all use his amazing resources that are available, but only if we commit our ways to him. Come over a few pages to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, and to make it very easy for you, verse 12 and 13 again. And the Lord make you to increase and abound in love one towards another, and towards all men, even as we do toward you, to the end he may establish your hearts unblameable in holiness before God, even our Father, at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ with all his saints. Notice who it is. He doesn't say make sure your hearts are strong and that you're blameless and holy and make sure you love each other. That's not what he says. He says, may the Lord make your love increase. May the Lord strengthen you. May the Lord help you to be blameless. It's God that works in us to help us to do these things. We are fighting the same sort of warfare that the Israelites were fighting when they entered into the Promised Land. Our part is to hate sin, avoid the association with ungodliness, keeping ourselves pure. God's part is to drive out the enemy of sin so that we are strengthened to the point where we become blameless and holy. There's no way Paul could have written to the Thessalonians, "Make sure you're blameless." They were humans just like us. They couldn't do that. But he could write to them and say, "You concentrate on what you can do, and God will make you blameless." Quite simply, the Israelites didn't hate the Canaanite way of life enough. They had not developed a hatred for sinfulness and immorality and pagan worship. And so they couldn't see the problem with heading down to the festivals of Dagon. And unfortunately, the same thing happens precisely with us. Sin doesn't seem so bad sometimes. We don't hate it enough. God's people mixed with the world around them without understanding they were compromising godliness. We're told in Romans to hate what is evil and to cling to what is good. We're not told to try to overlook the evil or watch the evil but don't copy it, or try not to get involved too much with the evil thing. No, we are told to hate the evil thing. I cannot see how it's possible to hate evil, and yet we still watch and listen to a lot of the stuff that goes on in the world, whether it's on television, phones, computers, or whatever it may be. If we aren't working on keeping separate from sinful thinking, how can we hope that God will keep his promise of driving out the sin and helping us become blameless and holy? One of the big problems with sin is that it doesn't seem so bad when you get used to it. You see it over and over and over. You see it enough times and it starts to become a normal part of life. And that's what it must have been like for the Israelites. They lived among the Philistines and the Canaanites, and many of the things those people did began to seem normal. That's the way people lived there. It seemed exciting, enjoyable, without being too bad. They started to overlook the bad habits, and then they grew accustomed to them, and then they started doing them. It didn't seem so bad when they saw it happen at the time, but the fact that God had commanded that sort of behaviour was no longer at the forefront of their minds. That's how it was for them, the Israelites, and unfortunately that's how it is for us as well. If we're not careful, sin starts to become normal. Every time we see an act of immorality, whether on social media, television, every time we see something ungodly on our phones, every time we read an article that promotes greed or lust, each time your defences against sin become to erode. Our view on what is acceptable is changing. If we don't counteract the effects that worldly things do by filling our minds with things of the Spirit, then we're going to have the same problem that the Israelites did by not driving out the Canaanites and the Philistines. God won't drive the enemy out while we keep associating with them. It's a little bit like the alcoholic who goes to his AA meeting at the pub. The Bible word for this is holiness or separateness. And we're told that without holiness, we won't see the Lord. We won't be in his kingdom. It's that important. We're familiar with the Bible term in it, not of it. We're all in the world in our day-to-day lives. We cannot change that. What we can change is whether or not we are of the world. Come back to Judges and we'll see 5 statements about why they failed as a nation and why they failed to drive out the Canaanites and the Philistines. So God gives us 5 reasons. Each time he says, this is why you're getting it wrong. In Judges 2, in the first few verses, it says, "And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I'll never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no league or covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be snares unto you. God did not drive them out before them because they had made covenants with them, agreements and alliances with them. They were told to break down the altars and to not make covenants, and instead they danced before the altars and made covenants and marriages in business and in their day-to-day lives. Consequently, God would not help them drive out the people. They compromised, and God didn't act for them as a result. If we compromise, he won't act for us either. God will stop driving out sin from our lives if we compromise with the sin. If we make agreements with the world like this. So the first area they went wrong was they made covenants with these people. The second reason is given in chapter 2 again in verse 20 and 21. And it says, And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, Because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died. So there's the second reason. First one was that they made covenants with the people. The second was that they had broken the covenant that they had originally made with God. And they had violated the covenant that they had made. When they agreed to be faithful to him and not compromise with the Canaanite nations, God would have fulfilled all that he had promised if only they had obeyed him. The people were so eager to embrace God's enemies that they are condemned to live with the consequences. And isn't that the way? We're so eager to embrace the things that we shouldn't do that he allows us to then live with the consequences of that. He allows us to be ensnared by our own foolishness just to learn how bitter the consequences of a sin can be. Many of today's worries and problems can be traced back to yesterday's disobedience. We need to set our hearts on wholehearted obedience. So the second thing was the broken covenant with God. The third reason is given in the next verse, verse 22. He says, I will use them, the nations, that through them I may prove Israel, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein, as their fathers did keep it, or not. So this reason is that God was using them to test Israel's faithfulness. So the word prove there is also the word test. Look at chapter 3 and verse 4, just over the page. And they were to prove or test Israel by them to know whether they would hearken unto the commandments of the Lord. So God left a whole lot of nations still in the area as a test for Israel. He used the pagan culture of the land and the people left in the land as a test. When they had an invitation to go and see a Philistine festival, it was a test from God to see whether they would do it or whether they wouldn't do it. And I'm sure the same thing happens for us today. That God uses the sinfulness of the world around us to see if we are faithful in the face of temptation. So when we're invited to go someplace that we know we shouldn't go, whether it might be a nightclub or an inappropriate movie, events, things like that, it's God testing us. Will we be faithful in the face of temptation, or will we fail? We know at work, if you make a stand in the first part of being there, it makes life a lot easier later than trying to explain why you weren't as good the first time, but then you're trying to uphold a standard. God uses these things to test us. He's seen how strong we are. He's certainly watching to see which way we turn and which way we go. If we don't hate sin, we can't expect God to drive it out. When the Israelites didn't see the Canaanites as the enemy, then God didn't help them. So that third reason was for testing. Reason number 4 is in chapter 3 and at verse 1. So these are the nations. God was teaching the people warfare. So he left them there to teach them warfare. So not only does he test, he also teaches. So the people in the wilderness had been in the wilderness. They were setting up tents and packing down tents. They weren't practicing warfare. This is why these people were left there. God was teaching the people warfare through having these nations that were left. He was deliberately leaving some pagan nations there to teach them how to fight. And again, this is relevant to us. God leaves worldly influences around us to help us develop skills to overcome these problems, to practice, to have the opportunity to say no to sinful activities. To do that is strengthening. It builds us up. It gives us character. And it helps us develop godliness and holiness. If there was no temptation, if things were easy, then we would never really become spiritually ready to say no. It's like any to do it over and over and over again until you get good at it, and then you keep doing it. If we want to be good spiritually, we have to practice. If you want to be good at riding a bike, you get a bike, you go and ride it and ride it and ride it some more, and then you call David and Daniel, and you ride with them, and you ride more and more and more until you become really good at it or realise you shouldn't be doing it. If you want to be really good at playing the piano, you practice and practice and practice, and you play and play, and you have lessons, and that's on the first day. And then if you're lucky enough, you get as good as somebody like Peter, and it becomes natural to them. If you want to get really good at resisting sin, you have to practice. You have to work at resisting temptation over and over again until it becomes second nature to you. Until when you get the invitation to go someplace that you know you shouldn't go, you don't have to even think about it anymore. Eventually you won't get asked in the end because they already know what the answer's going to be. The Israelites had to learn to fight the Canaanites and the Philistines, and we have to learn to fight the world. God gives us practice until we do it. Don't get like the people who think they only need one lesson or a new bike to be good enough. So the fourth reason is to teach. The fifth reason is in Judges 1 verse 19. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountain. Interesting. They had all the worldly advantages plus technology. They could produce iron chariots, and that is often the case. The world seems much more interesting, much more cleverer, much more sophisticated than the people of our God. If we just relied on our own cleverness, our own efforts in preaching the gospel, we couldn't possibly prevail. The world is so much better at doing that sort of thing. What can we possibly do with our limited budgets and our tiny capabilities? No more than the Israelites fighting the Canaanites. They didn't have a hope. Yet God expected them to succeed just as he expects us to succeed. Not because we have the ability to, and not because we have the technology, but because we have him. The greatest weapon of all, fighting for us. We can do all things through him who strengthens us. It has always been like that. God didn't choose a great warrior to go and fight Goliath. He chose David, a boy with nothing more than a sling and a stone. And when Jesus wanted to spread the gospel throughout the world, he didn't go to Greece and seek out the greatest philosophers and speakers of his time. He chose a bunch of uneducated fishermen from the backwater parts of Israel. He chose the most unlikely people he could find, and they were the ones chosen to do the job. We don't have the cleverest and the most capable people in our community, but we do have God, and that is all that matters. These Israelites failed to drive the people out of the land because they failed to let God work through them. So the fifth reason, they had an inferiority complex. They thought they weren't as good, as sophisticated. The Israelites didn't suddenly drive out the Canaanites, but they were intended to slowly take over the land with God's help. provided they didn't associate with the sinful pagan people who lived there. It was God's intention that they slowly take over the land. His intention was to create a nation of righteous people, free from idolatry and the sinful practices of the Canaanites and the Philistines. It didn't happen because they found the pagan ways too attractive. This is similar to what we're supposed to be doing today, slowly getting rid of all the sinful things that are in our lives. Don't let the attractiveness of this world overpower you like the Israelites did. At first it might seem good, but it leads to nothing. It's empty and unfulfilling, and it leads to death. We now have an opportunity to remember our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, a man who was able to get through great adversity to show only his single-sighted ambition to do the will of his Father. We are called to be separate, to come out from what the world has to offer us and to seek God, spend our own promised land and to become a part of God's glorious kingdom. Let's not fall for